Creator, when you see me, remember I'm just a human being. That's the words. That's the prayer. Warekura say hey Warekura say hey Warekura say hey Warekura say hey that's a hey Warekura say hey Warekura say hey yo Warekura say hey Warekura say hey Warekura say hey Warekura say hey that's a hey Warekura say 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 hey that's a hey Warekura say 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 hey that's a hey Warekura say hey Warekura say hey
Thank you, Randy, for that music, that blessing, and welcome all. I'm Margaret Cooley from Wilman Hill Retreat Center here in Western Massachusetts, and it's wonderful to be with you all, to be with you who are coming for the first time to our series and those who have been to others, those of you who have strong relationships and connections to the Bible, and those of you who are just barely familiar with it, those who have connections to God in many, many ways, whatever name you use for the Spirit, for the inner light. Welcome each of you to this space together. Welcome Randy Woodley from out in Oregon, and to Dorothy for being our elder today, to Kai Quirk and to Ann Collins, who will be reading the passage, and to Peter, who has been the visionary behind this series and will lead us through today's session. And you'll hear from Jen after I do this welcome from Beacon Hill Friends House. So welcome all. We're glad you're with us. I want to acknowledge that today, for the first time during this series, I'm actually at Wilman Hill. It's a blessing to be on the land while I'm greeting you all. And we want to acknowledge that the place we now call Wilman Hill is on land whose earliest known steward was Mashalisk, a Pecumtuck woman whose family fished and hunted and farmed here. And I want to especially acknowledge that April 10th is the anniversary of this land being colonized by English settlers, unjustly removing Mashalisk and her family, her descendants, from the care and connection to their homeland. I want to acknowledge that colonization has continued into the present in physical as well as virtual and other spaces, and that much work remains to restore right relationship with the land and with the many Native people still living. We call on our spiritual ancestors, the ancestors of this land, and the ancestors of our hearts to give us strength for the hard work ahead and to bring joy into this gathering now, to lift up our connection to the Spirit that unites us all and all of creation. As I arrived here to Woman Hill, I heard the phoebes and saw the shad blossoms just starting to form and the daffodils beginning to bloom. And as I speak to you, we are having a beekeeper set up beehives in the orchard, and the orchard trees are getting pruned. So I hope you can feel the land joining you in your spaces where you are. We'll have a brief tech welcome and welcome from Beacon Hill Friends House from Jen, and then we'll have a little bit of opening worship. And out of that worship, Peter will lead us into hearing from Randy a little more about Randy's connection to the Bible and his reason for choosing the particular passage and the relationship to that passage and the Bible in general. So we'll get to hear quite a bit from Randy, and then Kai and Ann will read the passage that Randy has chosen, and we'll have some time to share in probably in small groups and in a large group. And we're going to let the time flow. We're going to be in God's time today, so I'm not going to say what time things are happening. We're just going to have it unfold as it needs to. And Peter and Randy will let us know what the next step is, each point in the journey. We'll aim to close formally by about 5:15, and then folks are welcome to stay on longer for more informal sharing, and don't feel that you need to stay for the whole time, but we will be transitioning a little bit from 5:15 on to a more informal sharing. We're very excited that we'll be welcoming Benigno, and I think I saw Benigno join us today. Benigno Sanchez-Epler for our May session, and then Lynette Davis for our June session. So we look forward to those, and really grateful to have you all with us today. So Jen, I'll turn it over to you now.
Okay, thank you, Margaret. And hi, as Margaret said, my name is Jen Higgins-Newman. I'm the program manager here at Beacon Hill Friends House. As we're talking about the things that are blooming and new life being emerging, this photo is of our magnolia tree that looks close to this right now outside our library window. We're in urban downtown Boston, but this is a little piece of life that I really enjoy. So with that, I'll turn things over. We're going to have probably a moment of settling silence, and I'll turn things over to Peter and Randy.
Thank you, Living Spirit, for bringing us together here today. I have kind of a request of you all. In this series, we're trying to kind of bring some new voices that you may not have heard before, whether that's a different age group or a different branch of the Society of Friends or a different ethnic and cultural background, whatever. And so I'd like to kind of pray that all of us will enter into this with teachable hearts and a willingness to really listen. And a particular request for myself is to get out of my sort of colonized settler mentality of it has to go this way and this time frame, and just be present with Randy and with each other. So welcome, Randy. I'm not going to introduce Randy because you all could read it very well on the website, a little bio, and we want more time to hear anyway. So I'm going to launch right in, but I see that's behind you, right? That's your window. You live on the land, right?
Yeah, it's the fake screen, but it actually is out my back on my back porch, my back door. Yeah, the coastal mountain range.
I live in a beautiful spot. That's amazing.
Yeah, we feel very blessed.
Yeah. So Randy, I know we talked about this a little bit the other day, but I know that people would be very interested in how you, as a, I don't know if you're, as a follower of Jesus, that's, I think, the term you said you like to use, as a Indigenous, a person of Indigenous roots. What is your journey that you've gone through with this thing we call the Bible, you know, this bunch of books?
Yeah. Bunch of books. That's great. Yeah, I was raised in, at least partially, in a pretty evangelical sort of Baptist background. So of course, there's a high regard for the Bible as the Word of God, which is George Fox had some great things to say about that. But and so as an Indigenous person, the Christianity has sort of been captured by a Western worldview, and it takes away from what might be other worldviews. And in fact, even if you're not Indigenous, if you're a sort of generally a country folk, or you're used to being on the land and hearing stories like I grew up with, then you have to put on this sort of different set of lenses in order to look at this scripture, right? And so I always had sort of questions and concerns about that. I always loved the parables and the stories of Jesus. And then I ended up entering much later in life the erudite world of academia. Got my PhD, and now a tenured professor, and et cetera, et cetera. And it gave me the opportunity to really look at things from what I would consider my own perspective. And I began to realize that that we'd been captured by this Western worldview in terms of how we even look at Scripture. So now I look at the Scriptures, and I understand, first of all, that like 90% of the Scriptures are story. So I used to say 75%, and both of the Old Testament professors at my seminary corrected me, said, no, 90% is story. And it got me thinking, Western people don't generally understand story very well. It's a very sort of like propositional sort of thing, is to understand Scripture from what was classically taught from a Western perspective. And I thought, if you don't understand story, how can you even understand what's going on here? And so I began to understand that both conservative and progressive people generally are wrong in how they approach it. So conservative people are trying to prove that something usually did happen, and progressive people are usually trying to prove that it didn't happen. And none of that has anything to do with how the people wrote the story to be understood, right? And so when you tell a story, there are truths that you're trying to get across, or there's a point you're trying to get across. But in all of our, propositionalizing it, our numbering, and our context, and, chapters and verses and everything, I think we've lost the whole idea of story in Scripture, right? The narrative. And so, I'm very comfortable now with my understanding of Scripture as stories being told by Indigenous type people. They're much closer to an Indigenous worldview than a post-Enlightenment worldview, the people who wrote these stories, and how they meant for them to be understood. And so, so I try to understand them as if they were my elders telling me the story, and just understand, listen to the whole story and understand what the story is about, rather than trying to prove anything about it, but just accept it for the truth that's in it.
So if I understand it, if you're interpreting these most of these passages as being story, how does that, as a person that's trying to kind of interact with it, other than just not trying to prove anything, is there anything about how it can speak to you or work in your life?
Well, yeah, first of all, I think it's important that, and I kind of lean heavy on the erudite world of academia because it's not my favorite, um, uh, but there is certainly a good reason for scholarship to understand cultural backgrounds and what's happening in the story, behind the story, in order to even understand how it would apply to us personally. So one of the silliest things I think that happens is that we just take the words, as if they were coming from the person next door, in our modern era, and we try to apply those words. If we don't understand what's going on in the story, what's happening in the background, then we really don't understand the point of the story. So the stories have to be, first of all, understood in their own cultural context, and then as the work of understanding them in our cultural context. And man, is, especially United States of America has a very weird cultural context, right? To try and fit these ancient stories into.
So we're going to go to Luke pretty soon, but before we do, I've just been watching a bunch of, Randy has a great website, aloha.org. I don't know if I said that right, but it's full of articles, interviews, cool stuff. So I've been listening to a lot of these writings and teachings of Randy and his wife, Edith. And a lot of the Quakers in this room, I know, are in regional groups that are really wrestling with right relationship with Native peoples. And our yearly meeting is working on a letter of apology and really asking Friends meetings to kind of live into that and figure out what that's all about. And I was interested because a lot of people, we're not trying to ask Indigenous people to tell us what to do, but I know that in the beginning of that interview from, I think it's called Radical Christians or something like that, the guy asked you, what would you ask the white evangelical churches to do to get things right with Native peoples? And I just wondered if you could share that, if you remember what you said. I liked it.
Randy, I think you're muted.
That was the first question of the interview, and I think my answer might have that was as far as some people probably read, but I said the only just thing for the evangelical white churches to do, and that was the context in which he was talking about, is to sell their buildings and property and possessions and basically give it to all the different people they've harmed in order to obtain that through both illegal and immoral means. And I should, by the way, recognize that I'm on the land of the Kalapuyan people, unceded land of the Kalapuyans, especially the Yamal and the Tualatin bands. And so I am also a settler on another people's land. I'm not in my own homeland.
So I'm sure maybe after we get to that kind of post 515 period, people may have some more responses to that. But why don't we go to the Luke? So I asked you, like I do all these leaders, to kind of listen to your heart and see what's rising for you. And I have no idea really fully why you chose this, but why don't you take a few minutes to share what led you to choose this particular passage in the gospel.
Okay, so people, I'm assuming, have looked at that passage already.
I think that probably they have. They certainly were invited to, but it's you can say the first couple lines if you want, just because that kind of might nudge their memory as to what we're talking about. But we're not going to hear it in a few minutes.
Well, Jesus is, at his hometown in Nazareth, and he's in the synagogue, and basically this is his, I think, his own understanding of what his mission is, who he is in life. He's lived these 30 years in the small town, and now he's starting to travel around, and he's starting to figure out, what is he all about? And so he's going to tell his hometown. And basically from that, there's a number of things we can get. And I'm just going to list some quick points, then we can go into those if you want, or I can talk more about the story. But first of all, Jesus is relying on an ancient understanding in Judaism, what I call the Shalom, Sabbath, Jubilee construct. So this is where he's coming from. And I can go more into what that's about if you'd like. He understands it differently than most of the people around him, is the second point. He's come to revitalize that construct so that people can actually apply it and make it real. The construct is mostly concerned with the marginalized in society and that there be equal justice for all. And then it's non-exclusive. The story goes on. It's very apparent that Jesus is including non-Jews, everyone, and recognizing the fact that all people have a relationship with God, and that everyone has equal access to God. And of course, that didn't make the people around him very happy for him bringing that good news. But yeah, so all of that is in this, announcement, and that's why I chose that. If we're going to look at the work, the life, etc. of Jesus, well, then we need to know who he thought he was and what he was about. You're muted, Peter.
You're muted.
I'm kind of inclined to think we should just go ahead and hear the passage. And actually, you can say a few more words after we hear it if you want, before we break into groups. Okay. So why don't we?
Yeah, I'd love that.
I hope you're ready to go, readers. And I'm kind of changing, but I'm trying to follow spirit here. So let's hear the words, and then Randy, you may want to say a little bit more about the Jubilee and Shalom construct, as you say. Let's hear the passage.
Luke 4, 16 to 30, New Living Translation. When he came to the village of Nazareth, his boyhood home, he went as usual to the synagogue on the Sabbath and stood up to read the scriptures. The scroll of Isaiah the prophet was handed to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where this was written. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim that captives will be released, that the blind will see, that the oppressed will be set free, and that the time of the Lord's favor has come. He rolled up the scroll, handed it back to the attendant, and sat down. All eyes in the synagogue looked at him intently. Then he began to speak to them. The scripture you've just heard has been fulfilled this very day.
Everyone spoke well of him and was amazed by the gracious words that came from his lips. How can this be? They asked. Isn't this Joseph's son? Then he said, you will undoubtedly quote me to this proverb, physician, heal yourself, meaning do miracles here in your hometown like those you did in Capernaum. But I tell you the truth, no prophet is accepted in his own hometown. Certainly there were many needy widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the heavens were closed for 3.5 years and a severe famine devastated the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them. He was sent instead to a foreigner, a widow of Zarephath in the land of Sidon. And many in Israel had leprosy in the time of the prophet Elisha, but the only one healed was Naaman, a Syrian. When they heard this, the people in the synagogue were furious. Jumping up, they mobbed him and forced him to the edge of the cliff, edge of the hill on which the town was built. They intended to push him over the cliff, but he passed right through the crowd and went on his.
So you have this incredible storyteller who's telling this story, and I'm going to, at the very end, make sure I point out something that's sort of hidden in the passage there, if you will. So Jesus is relying on this ancient Shalom, Sabbath, Jubilee construct. So if you're unfamiliar, so basically things are set up, the stories in Genesis, there's basically this balance, and then what we would call shalom, or as Native people would call our harmony way construct, where everything is in balance. The sun, the moon, the light, everything is working the way it's supposed to. And then the first 11 chapters of Genesis are basically instances of shalom being broken on every level, of the peace, of the harmony being broken at every level, civil levels, family levels, between creation and human beings, etc. Throughout the book, Exodus and Deuteronomy, you have all these sort of laws that are set up, or guidelines about how to treat people in your land who don't have rights, the marginalized. Don't glean the edges of your field. Leave it there, because both the poor people and the animals have to eat. Set aside 1/7 of your land every year, so that for the same reason, so our seeds can come up. These were non-GMO, non-Monsantoized seeds, right? That would just volunteer to come up. And then you left that. And so if all these agricultural people are leaving that, then there's lots of places for people to eat. Lots of places for people to gather. If you forget a bunch of grapes out there in the field, just leave them. Somebody else will get them. If you forget a bunch of wheat, the same thing. There's all these sort of provisions. And then on the 7th year, you left all of your land fallow, and you saved up, and then other people were invited to feast off of your land. So there's these laws set up, these Sabbath laws, and then there are all these different 7 years for up to 49 years. And on the 50th year is Jubilee, or the day of the Lord, as it was referred to there. And so what is that about? That means, all debts are going to be forgiven. The land goes back to its original owner. The prisoners are set free. All of this is included in this whole Shalom Sabbath Jubilee construct. And there's this great leveling effect every 50 years. So it's both, if you will, to borrow a few modern terms, capitalistic, but very limited, and socialistic. So people can get wealthy, but only for 2.5 generations, and then it all levels back out. You can't get too poor, and you can't get too wealthy. And so there's this great leveling effect that's occurring. And so, and then the prophets, what are the prophets doing? They are calling people back to this Jubilee construct, to this shalom, to have mercy, to walk in justice, to not cheat each other, to, all of these kinds of things. In Isaiah 61 is particularly where Jesus is reading from and quoting from. And so the reason in Isaiah that all of these things are mentioned, it says, because I, the Lord, love justice. And so all of this is in the background of Jesus. I'm pretty sure he probably planned on being there that day to read this scripture, or that's how the story goes. And so he's making this announcement of, this is who I am. So, but they weren't getting it, apparently. And so then he brings in the fact that there's a Syrophoenician widow who Elijah had visited. And even though there were lots of widows started in Israel, God went to this one outside of Israel. And then there was this Syrian oppressor named Naaman. And Naaman was an occupying force in Israel at the time. If anybody had reason to hate them and not care for them. And yet he says, God sends Elisha to heal him of his leprosy. And this is a case of, Jesus's example of loving your enemies, right? So, and so all of that happens, and then they basically try to kill him. What I think is interesting in the story is that he names, there's a holy triad throughout all of the Old Testament and even into the New Testament of making sure you defend the widows, orphans, and foreigners, the immigrants. Widows, immigrants, and orphans are not allowed to possess land, basically. They don't have access to a way of making their own capital. And so you have to take care of them, and this was part of the Shalom Sabbath Jubilee construct, so they could take care of themselves. It's interesting that the storyteller mentions a widow and an immigrant, a foreigner, if you will, in the story. And then I always said, well, there's that holy triad. Who's the orphan? And remember, Jesus is in his hometown. It's kind of neat the way that story is told, that he becomes the orphan. at that point. And so the point is across. You're not practicing shalom. You're not practicing the order and the way that God set up all people to behave, which is for equality, which is for justice, which is to take care of the most marginalized in society. And so that's what this passage is about, and that's what Jesus represents.
And am I right in saying that part of the way people don't get this is not only that they think that only their own people are the ones that are supposed to be, blessed and receive all these good things, but also that they see a hierarchy between humans being the ones who get the blessing and not all of creation, not the land. In fact, is it possible that we could reread this as being walk into this as being, I've come to proclaim good news to the polar bears that are losing their ice, good news to the rivers that are being polluted, good news to the honeybees that are being poisoned,
Yeah, and I make that point in, there's a book I wrote called Shalom in the Community of Creation and Indigenous Vision. And I make that point, the fact that I think that we always have trouble with this word kingdom, but at the time of King James, in his existence, he liked that word kingdom. It's not really there, but that's the translation that occurs when the Bible is translated there. I think a better word that Jesus would use for this realm would be the whole community of creation now, because at that time there was no concept of creation as in danger. We're going to, drive things to extinction and all that. But now there is, and I think very much that it's not just about humans at all. It's about all of us and our reciprocal relationship to one another. And we have to preserve that, every species, including the humans. And yes, we do take it very ethnocentrically or anthropocentrically. We see ourselves as the center of our Creator's purview, as opposed to everyone else is just as important. And so anytime our religion begins to exclude others, we can be pretty sure that that's not what Jesus taught.
A lot of Quakers that I know are not huge fans of Paul, but I'll have to say that I'm kind of blown away by 8:18 in Romans, where he actually says that, it's not just that we are going to be brought into this life and this new kingdom, but the creation itself. And it's really suffering, not just the people who are, let's say, oppressed under Roman rule or something like that, but the actual created whole.
Yeah. So, and this is where Paul, we suspect he might be Native American, because he talks about creation giving birth as in the pains of childbirth. So he's referring to Mother Earth.
Okay, well,
which is where everything comes from.
Sorry, unless you've got something else to say, we could go to the breakout groups for a few minutes, give people a chance to talk to each other, chew over what you've been saying and what Luke's been saying, and then we'll come back in about 15 minutes. Let me just say, I don't think you had any real requests of the groups, right? Sometimes people have been given prompts, but you're just going to kind of let people go with where the Spirit takes them, right? Okay.
Yeah, so, I wanted to be more Quaker about this.
So I just checked with Randy, and he said he'd like to just let us open it up at this point.
So we'll just settle in. Andy?
Randy, I really appreciate what you're bringing to us today. I would be interested in your reflection on the Jubilee. as a vision of what's possible, and especially like the emotional response. I read in Jubilee jubilation, the breaking out of joy, happiness, gladness, contentment. Like it's something to imagine as possible.
Yeah, thank you. Although that's one part of it, right? The other part is sort of like Mary's song in Luke chapter 2. While those who have been disenfranchised are inheriting, those who have inherited so much are becoming disenfranchised. And so part of the jubilation, I'm sure, was only half, partly jubilation. Some people weren't so happy about it. Yeah, I understand that as absolutely being structured in our laws and in our safety nets, as we call them, and that we are not doing enough to create safety nets for people, to create places for people to empower themselves, and which is part of the disenfranchised construct that we talked about in that whole Sabbath system, is that people are being empowered to care for themselves or care for one another. And then finally, that there be well, equality is one thing, and that's something we lack, but equity is certainly to me, at the bottom of this. Does everybody have enough to do enough for themselves and their own families and neighbors, etc.? And so I think we're really lacking in our society and our laws in the equity. We've really got to work on that. So to me, Jubilee goes to the heart of this issue of equity. My own personal jubilation or satisfaction is really a byproduct of the values that have been structured in our society. And that's what I would call shalom. Shalom, I often refer to as structured love. So first of all, a large portion of the Cherokees during those times did condemn slavery. They were abolitionists, especially the more full-blood traditional elements. And there was a missionary named Evan Jones, who was a infamous abolitionist who was, teaching against slavery throughout the whole nation. And so, but a lot of the tribes did have slaves. And even before black chattel slavery, there were systems of slavery. Now, I think the line gets fuzzy, right, between indentured servitude, which a lot of people actually sold themselves into a 7-year period when they came to this country. And then they would be freed. But what happens is they begin to divide their rights by race. And so black folks who are indentured servants, they start having other restrictions put on them. And then eventually their time can be renewed. And there's a wonderful book out right now called 400 Souls that I've been reading that's talking all about this sort of transition and what happens. And it was definitely by race. So you can't say indentured servitude was similar to slavery in that sense. So it was, but yeah, I think all forms of slavery are wrong, but there also were native slaves. People would capture people from other places, not for profit, but usually because like someone had died from, there was this sort of retribution, if you will, among our Cherokee people. I'll just use that example. And it was, I think, more along the lines of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So it's a perversion of what I would call our harmony way. But if someone from another tribe by reason or village killed a person from your clan, you had the right to either go and kill or capture someone from there and then make them a slave. Now, most of the time, those folks would either later be let go or even be adopted as a member of the family. But so I think there's lots of kinds of slavery, and I think black chattel slavery was probably the worst of them all. So, and that certainly, I think examining someone's wealth according to the amount of slaves is so sick and perverted. I don't know how that stood the test of time for so long.
I just want to make a comment. It's not nearly so nitty gritty as slavery. The word at the beginning of the passage about Jesus having been brought up there or raised there, the Greek word would literally, I mean, in koine, would be having been fed. And I just thought that fit in so nicely with all the business about gleaning and letting the ox eat the grain as he treads it out and so on. I couldn't figure any way how to. There's 9 uses of that word, and the other 8 are all translated with nourish or feed or something on that order. I couldn't find any way to get raised there with nourish, but I just thought it was really fit in so lovely.
I'm thinking a little bit, Randy, about what you said about how the jubilation may be promised, or the joy to the poor and to the marginalized, but isn't necessarily going to be quite as happy for those at the other end, the ones who've got it all now, so to speak. It wasn't necessarily good news for the emperor, or the head of the legions. And thinking a little bit about how I didn't even know, I don't know how I made it through Sunday school without reading the version in Luke of the Beatitudes. We just read the Matthew version. We didn't read the version in Luke 6 where it's the woes and the blessings. And I guess what I'm wondering about is, and I'd like to ask you about, is we call it good news. Is it good news? I just had a big meal at Easter dinner. I still feel kind of full, and is it going to be good news for the people who've got really big houses, and really big cars and a lot of power, and who everybody talks well of, so to speak? Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What is the message how's it going to land, to the people that are in the top of the heap?
Well, when it's your personal choice, and you still get to go on and do what you want, I think it just lands as so what, right? But when there's structures in place that say, oh, you can only do so much, and then you're maybe taxed at a much, much higher rate, or et cetera, a fair tax system, or whatever means you're talking about that would create this equity, then it could be good news if you have the right attitude. It could be, well, I've done what I can, and now I get to bless other people. But I guess that all depends on where you're at, I know for me, and I'm sure for probably everyone here, you've probably had times of prosperity and times of real poverty in your life. I know I have. And there are times when I've lost things, and then it felt somewhat freeing. So, I think we're just built as humans to sort of especially I think about my parents, for example. My dad's 95, my mom's 93. They lived through the Depression, and they became somewhat hoarders, especially my mother, because, she was extremely poor. They never had enough to eat. And so they always wanted to make sure, but we all of a sudden, the situation came where we had to get rid of a lot of that stuff. And she was really upset about it. But then later on, she felt like, well, I didn't need all that stuff. So, I don't know, it's part of the human experience is to have times of feast and times of famine, and figure out what our attachment's going to be during both.
Hi. So I was thinking about, you were talking about so many of these as stories, and I know that in many Native American cultures, oral storytelling is the primary means of sharing information and sharing, any that's the best now, but sharing things. And thinking about how then that shifts and changes over time, and so thinking about syncretism as these stories from the Bible come in, what are ways that in thinking about them as stories that I guess that they shift and change to you, or when they are then told vocally? I'm not sure. Is that clear, or I can try to say it in a different way?
So you mentioned syncretism, which I understand. The mixing of things that maybe don't belong together, right? So can we like add our own cultural understandings and then still kind of have the message of the original story? Is that what you're asking?
Or yeah, and I mean, and as things, you were talking about understanding the culture from which the story comes from, which is not modern America, and or for people who are like yourself, you were talking about coming as if the stories were being told by ancestors, but you've also heard different kinds of stories that come from Native American ancestors, and so like how some of those things come together, I think.
Yeah. So I have to remember that those aren't my Native ancestors who are telling those stories. Yeah. But there are different people who I probably don't understand well. And so there's a sense of humility in which I have to both approach the story, and also a sense of humility in the surety that I have that my understanding is the complete understanding, if you will. So we're all just doing our best, right? To understand, and I think the Spirit works with that. But it's no excuse to not do our work to understand what's really happening there in the scriptures. And so, but yeah, it does help me to sort of, when I think about in general terms, that these are pre-Enlightenment people. And my people are pre-Enlightenment people, and they haven't been affected by a Western worldview. And I understand, I've studied deeply, have a lot of critique against the Western worldview. I think it's one of the most dangerous things that we're dealing with right now. But it's easier for me to not have to go through an Enlightenment worldview, and we all have parts of that, right, that we're dealing with. But to sort of like think of another story, think of an elder telling that story. What are they really trying to get across? What's their heart about when they're trying to get this across? And it's to teach us how to live, and to live well, and to live well with one another. And if that's not the point, in other words, I see that in all of Jesus's stories, basically. And if I see another story that's telling me something different, then I realize that there's another reason for that story. It's not there to tell me, for example, the story that was there. There are some stories that were told well for settlers first got here, and then that was that Native Americans are the Canaanites, and we're the giants in the land, and we had to be destroyed. So that was they actually took that one literally, but that story in Joshua is not there to tell me how to live with other people. It's telling me how not to live with other people. It's telling me, how you can become nationalistic to the point that you're willing to kill and destroy men, women, children, animals, etc. And so I look to sort of Jesus' words to tell me how to live, and then I measure all the other stories against those. That's probably not an answer, but that's what comes to my mind right now.
Thank you, and just wonderful to hear whatever comes of it.
I sort of questions and comments, Randy. Let me take my hand down. This story aspect, I'm glad you brought that up, and our friend Peggy Sanger Morrison talks about stories being pert near true, which means that's a story that's so true it don't matter a lick whether it really happened or not. And that has been so helpful to me in reading these stories. And this story is told by Mark and Luke and Matthew slightly differently each time, but there's truth in it. And as a person who's lived in a small town, one of the things about stories, when people tell them to you, is that you experience them. And in this story, as a person who's lived in small towns, there's this element of, oh, sheesh, this is Josh. We know him. He son of a single mother that lived in the trailer park, and he's gone off to college, and he's going to come back and tell us what's right. Especially if he's going to tell us something that makes us uncomfortable. I know just how a small town and how I, as a respected citizen of a small town, might be discomforted by that. And I also think about what incredible courage it took Jesus to do that, because he knew exactly, if he was true to his message and proclaimed that good news in that town, that he would get that kind of reception. And to try to put myself in those shoes, and would I have the courage to do what he did with the message, gives me great pause. So I want to thank you for just bringing that whole thing up in front of us, and the story, the whole importance of looking at all these things as story, as narrative, for us to put our shoes in and feel what it's like to be inside that story. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. One of the things that Jesus also knew, I too have lived in a small town of 5,000. That's probably not I think Nazareth is probably 300 to 400 maybe. My wife comes from a town of 300 on the Wind River Reservation, so she might relate more to that. But he knew exactly how to push the buttons as well. And he didn't hesitate. Sometimes it takes those pushing the buttons to get truth across.
So thank you all for coming to the table with us here. Those of you who didn't get called on, stick around. We'll definitely have some time to call on people who didn't reach yet. I want to just thank a few people here. I want to thank Woolman Hill and Beacon Hill for hosting this series. I know we couldn't have done it without you guys making this possible. Please support these kinds of important institutions in the fabric of our faith community to the extent that you're able. Thank you to Kai Quirk from New England Yearly Meeting and Ann Collins from South Central Yearly Meeting for reading for us today, and to Dorothy Henderson from Pacific Yearly Meeting, who's both eldering in this spring series and also serving on my oversight of ministry committee through Mount Toby Friends Meeting. And of course, thank you, Randy. Let's have a little Quaker appreciation here.